And so, for those of you that are watching this in the audience, we thought after last week's successful podcast on Andrea giving up alcohol for 365 days, we'd follow a similar thread today on something that impacts so many people, and it's not really talked about that much. And so, Anita's kindly offered herself up to talk a little bit about some of the things in her past around food and her relationship with food and binge eating today. And so I'm really delighted to be able to share the space with you today. How are you today, and how are you when thinking about this topic?
Good. I've talked about it to death for the last 20 years. So but definitely talk about it more from the perspective, I think, it's that thing of how we work with clients and knowing that a lot of the things that, came up with Andrea last week is the same, whether it's alcohol, whether it's, food, eating disorders, whatever our vice is, it all comes down to, same stuff. And how we work with people, how I work with people, how I work with clients is the same, as the tools and techniques that, that helped me with my vice, which was around food. So good, feeling good.
Fab, awesome. Looking forward to it. So why today then? So you've told this story so many times over the last 20 years. What's alive for you today that brings this to the table again?
To exactly what I just said there, right? For other people, right. If people are struggling. Yeah. And I think it's one of those things that when I was, when I developed an eating disorder back at probably, I was about 13 at the time, even through to then 13 to 26, when I first went to therapy to talk about it, there wasn't a label of binge eating back then. It was anorexia, bulimia were kind of the main things that were talked about. So it was always this thing of going, I'm sure there's something wrong, but at the time it was like, well, it's not anorexia and it's not bulimia. So what is it? And then years later, this label of, binge eating has become more popularized. And I think, very relevant in a way because, labels can be useful. And definitely when that came about, I was like, okay, if I was younger, my younger years, this probably would have been quite a useful thing to have known about. And definitely some of the tools that were learned through coaching. I don't know, had I learned them earlier, would it have made a difference earlier? I don't know. I do believe that it's a culmination of all of the therapy that I had. Coaches can poo-poo therapy, but for me it was very transformational. And I think by the time I came into coaching, maybe was ready to hear the next level kind of layer onto it. So
for sure. Yeah. Okay, cool. And so you mentioned that this started around the age of 13 and carried on through to 26. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah. Before I did anything about it in terms of seeking help.
Yeah. So tell me about those 13 years. How did it start? How did it evolve? What looking back in hindsight, what was going on at the time that led to the, quote unquote binge eating for you?
Yeah, I think it was definitely something, around definitely family life and growing up and, the environment and what I was watching growing up in terms of adults and their behaviors. And I think a big thing that I, learned later in life is that I didn't grow up around a family that drank. There wasn't alcohol in my direct experience. So as I grew up and I watched maybe friends having more kind of issues with alcohol, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why that is. Because my experience wasn't that adults drunk. I didn't really know about that because that didn't happen in my household. But we did have a big, I guess our comparison would have been, food. Food is love and food is comfort. So, growing up around that's I guess the pattern that got developed. And I always remember I was at boarding school from quite a young age, and there was a lot around food there. A lot was centered around eating and midnight feasts and just, getting sweets was a real treat and things like that. And I don't know, we just seemed to eat a lot. And I remember we used to get weighed about once a year. And I was always tiny. And I remember, I must have been around 12 years old or something like that. And I remember I was like one of the lightest ones. There was girls that would be quite embarrassed about their weight and not want to, say how much they were. And I would always just be like, yeah, who cares? And then I remember that, I think, because the irony was of it was a few months or a year or two later, puberty hit and I started to develop more curves, and that's when, you know, the paranoia started to come in, and that's when I did become really aware of the scales and the weight. So younger
Right.
years it was fine. I was the small one. I was, you know, was quite tiny. And then I don't know whether I used to be able to eat what I wanted. I don't think I was that bothered about food. And then when the weight started to come on, then it became quite a big thing. And yeah, so from 13 to 26 was, yeah, just a really love-hate relationship with food.
So take me
And
back a little bit. So
yeah,
it sounds like, you know, food represented to you love and comfort was
yeah.
what you shared. So, and it sounded like it started much earlier than 13. Like how far back would we go with the association of
Well,
love and
I
comfort?
didn't have anything prior to that, but it would have been just the environment, right? So food was, you know,
Yeah.
I don't have any kind of memories prior to that of it being an issue for me.
Mm.
It's more when I hit 13. So I guess in terms of family life, a lot was centered around, you know, food and meals, and you know, family members loving cooking and spending lots of time eating great foods. I don't know. I don't really have a lot there. I just know that it was the association started when I started to put on weight, or, you know, hit puberty or whatever. So
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
And so you're at
prior to that,
secondary
really.
school. So you're at
Yeah.
secondary school when you were 13. Is that kind of when it started? Was it a school thing or was it something else in the environment that led you to become a little
I
more
think it was
conscious of
just getting curves, just getting, you know, hitting
just getting
puberty. I think
curves?
that's that would
Yeah,
be
yeah,
my,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And then stuff starting to change, then going, okay, I'm putting on weight now. There's weight coming on, and um, yeah, I guess it was that's all I've got. I could make up other stuff, but that's
Yeah,
what's actually front
that's
and
what comes to
center.
mind.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
so
what's
I
been.
mean, I guess on the whole, our identity is changing so much through that period of 13 to 26. Um, you know, and I guess the food relationship just goes along with it, with the identity change. So I'm curious, you know, how did you know it was time to do something about it at 26?
Well, I
What
knew
was
years before that. I was talking about
right?
this. This is what, like, it's interesting because even though it was 26 when I got a therapist, but I think I've said this many times before, but for as long as I can remember, I've been a talker. So there's always been a friend or two friends where we just dissect everything. So this was,
Hmm.
I don't know, in my teenage years, always, you know, having someone that I would talk to about this stuff. And it was probably from about 19 going, oh, maybe I should go and see a therapist. So it took a few years before I actually went to see anyone. Um, and I think what happened at that time around 26 was I actually met my boyfriend, who I went into my first long-term relationship with. So I think there was a bit of a sense around that of going, I need to do something about this. And I actually remember
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because it was such a big deal back then. No one really did therapy. I maybe had a couple of friends, and I didn't tell many
Right.
people that I was in therapy. And I remember sitting down with him in a pub one day, and I just met him, right? And I just was crying as I was telling him that I was going to therapy and about this eating stuff. I smile now because it's so, you know, it's, yeah. I guess as well now it's so common for people to have coaches and therapists and things like that. That back then it was such a big deal. So yeah, so that kind of prompted me to start that, and then I loved it. I mean, I remember I went to the first therapist I went to, just sitting there and bawling my eyes out, and it was just like I just loved it because I'd always loved talking about myself, and it was this or delving in. I say that I say delving into stuff with a professional. And this was actually the interesting thing because there was always one person in my life that I talked to. I wouldn't actually talk to many people about it, but there was this sense as well that I'm paying this person, and it was just like such a relief to be able to speak to someone about, yeah, as many people I'm sure feel as they come into coaching. I had that experience once as well. And yeah, it was just, yeah, I was like, why didn't I start this, you know, ages ago kind of thing. And I think, you know, that whole process then from 26, I was in therapy for 8 years. We didn't really talk about the food. It wasn't because it came down to the whole, you know, what does food represent is love. And then that was, you know, more of the conversations that happened rather than directly about it being food. But yeah, it was definitely the association. I remember, you know, talking about things like, so because there was this kind of comfort in the food, even when I lived on my own, I would never have food. Well, I never actually lived on my own. So when I moved out of home and I lived with flatmates, I would never have food in the house. It was just like a no-no. Never kept food in the house. And I had this thing where as soon as whoever I lived with left the house, I would find myself at the fridge. And it was this carried on for however many years. And then when I moved in with my ex-boyfriend, it was really interesting because I'd done all this work now and I'd realized this whole association. And then it became, he would go out the house and I would find myself at the fridge. But by this point, it was like, well, I have love because I'm with someone and I've got love. So why do I need the food? And it was like that awareness was then there at the fridge and I didn't need to eat any of the food in the fridge, right? Because it was kind of like catching myself and going, well, if this is for love and you've already found love, then why do you need the food? So this is kind of the unraveling of it over the years. And yeah, definitely lots of secret eating along the way, yo-yo dieting, doing every diet under the sun, and I would lose weight and it would just quickly come back on, and then I'll just be in these cycles. I mean, it wasn't like people always go, oh, how much? And it was about 10 pounds, let's say. It's like, not massive amounts. It wasn't like, but it didn't matter what the weight was. It was obviously the association and the mentality around it. So yeah, that was it. So that was like 8 years of that through therapy. And then I was moving over to Australia. So therapy ended. And by this point, I was still, I was pretty okay. Like it wasn't completely resolved, but after 8 years, there was a lot that had been done. And then coming to Australia and then getting coaching, that was kind of like just the next layer of it, the next level of work to be done. As I said, had I have had a coach back in the day, would it have changed anything? I don't really know. I think sometimes a process, needs to be done as it needs to be done. So I do, because I hear a lot of coaches and they'll be doing, stuff in eating disorders and all the rest of it, going, if you'd have found me years ago, you wouldn't have had any problem. It's like, well, we don't know this. So I think there's processes to go through.
We get what we're ready for, right, I guess. And what was that next level when you went into the coaching?
Yeah.
What was the next level that unfolded once you started that in Australia?
So I would say there's a distinct, it was actually one of the coaches that I had back then. And it was something that we were learning at the time. So this was right at the start of coach training. And it was something that I worked so much with because it was so beneficial for me. And we talked about it as well with Andrea last week. And this was all around the permission frame. So giving self permission. And I this was years ago, but I remember this so distinctly, sitting in my house in Bondi and doing this session with this coach and her saying to me, I'd obviously had something going on because I brought this to the table at the time around chocolate. So chocolate was always my kind of probably the main go-to. And I can't remember the ins and outs of it, but I'm assuming that there was something going on with me and chocolate at that time in Bondi. And I just remember her sitting there saying to me, can you give yourself permission to just eat blocks of chocolate or that block of chocolate? And I was like, just no way, absolutely no way. I was like looking at her like she was a bit crazy, even though I've probably already heard this in the coach training. But anyway, I was like, no, it just did not, for me, it just did not resonate. And I was like any of my clients that I say, can you give yourself permission to do whatever it is you're doing and be okay with it, kind of thing? It was the same thing. I was like, absolutely no way. I'll be obese if I allow myself to just let loose on as much chocolate as I wanted. And anyway, so I came away from that session and yeah, obviously that stayed with me. And within, I don't know how many days or whatever it was, I was like, actually, no, that makes sense. And yeah, I took that on from there. And it was just like, if I want to have chocolate, rather than the rules that I would always put on myself previously, it's like, I'm never going to eat chocolate again, or I'm never going to, do this again or whatever. It just became, okay, yeah, do it if you want. And I think from there, yeah, it was fine. And I think the difference was that whereas in the past it would be I would eat loads of food and then I'd feel really bad the next day, which would often like lead into cycles of then eating again, because it's kind of like what's going to shut the voice in my head up that's judging myself for eating all of that. It's like just stuff something in again. And within that, it just became, I'd eat. And if there were days where I did want to eat a whole block of chocolate, then I did. But the difference was that I wasn't thinking about it or beating myself up about it the next day. So that was just like life changing. And I would say from that point, my weight was probably the most stable that it had ever been from there on. And I don't, I'm not sitting there saying that it didn't stop me from eating chocolate, because that wasn't that. I mean, it may have been a goal at some point in my life, but really there just wasn't that attachment to it anymore. And I think I would go through phases as well, where there'd be times where it was just like, where, I don't know, it might be Christmas or something, and I'd be like, yeah, that's what I do at Christmas, eat loads of chocolate. And then there'd be other times in the year where there was just something going on in the system. I might have had some blood test done or something where it's like, okay, not having the chocolate is going to be more beneficial for now. And it was never stopping myself. It was just, the health was being prioritized in those moments. Choice. And chocolate wasn't being eaten. And I've had that experience probably over the last year as well, where there's just, I'm just watching my health a lot more now. And because I have such a high priority over the health, that I just don't get the cravings that were never really cravings, or the association to eat the chocolate like I used to. So it's really, I think for me, it's just, from changing those meanings, which is obviously all in the work that we do. It's quite just, for me, just like to think back to how I was in my 20s, early 30s. Like I was so consumed with it. And if I was able to know back then how I would be now, it probably would have been pretty unbelievable. And I think when I first started talking about this in this capacity on a podcast, I think there was a podcast I did maybe 4 years ago, maybe. And this podcaster was asking me these questions. I sat there, I was like, and that was that realization, because it's just like with a lot of this work, it's gradual. And it's not like it's an overnight thing necessarily, right? Stuff takes time. And by the time it's kind of changed, we've forgotten how bad it might have been. And when I was having this interview, I was like, God, now I'm talking about this, it's crazy to actually think how much of my life was consumed with that, to think that that was always going to be my life and there was no other way, that things were never going to change. To then realizing, through all of this work and changing those meanings and associations, how powerful, doing this kind of work really is. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, amazing. And we talked a bit about, I guess the mental side of things.
Yeah.
So, and the meaning making, and obviously there was an association going on with love and comfort, and then there was self-talk that was going on, and, that was driving the eating, and you wanted your circumstances to change. And so you changed the meaning. What was going on the emotional level?
So what do you mean by that, in terms of what?
Well, often for a lot of people, there can be shame attached with, eating cycles. Okay. Or there can be some sadness where there's a feeling of an emptiness or a void in one's life. And, so I say this quite often when I work with clients that have got some sort of eating or any kind of, putting things in the mouth. And I mean, I take nicotine. So people ask me all the time, what's that all about? That's about switching on the brain. But yeah, whenever we've got any sort of oral addiction, often it's accompanied by some sense of shame or embarrassment, guilt or sadness. So
I would say, shame's not a word that resonates. Never been one of mine. I would say definitely there was guilt around it. I would feel sorry for myself as well. I think there was definitely, that was the program that I think, because I saw so much destruction of people being highly judgmental of themselves in a disgusted way. Right. Yeah, I felt sad. I felt sorry. I remember feeling really sad for myself. And I do remember feeling like just having moments when I was a teenager, just going like, how can this be what life is about? I remember crying quite a lot about it and just feeling, really sad about it. Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it, how we can associate like a little piece of chocolate or some sort of sweet or whatever it is with love.
They weren't little pieces ever.
Family block all
That's
at once, is it?
that's that. Yeah, I mean, it's binge eating. It's
My
not just
my
having
my
if it
flatmate
was a piece of chocolate, it'd be easy, right? It'd be no problem.
my flatmate, in London back in the mid-20s. Big love to you. If you're watching, you know who you are. She used to come back to the apartment and she'd have the big boxes. I don't know whether you remember them, of Marks and Spencer's chocolate bites. Do you remember those double chocolate bites from Marks? God,
Vaguely.
they were good. And she would just sit down and
Tubs, are you sure?
yeah, oh, but we'd sit there together and we'd just inhale a whole box of
Yeah.
them. She'd do 3/4 of them, and that was a thing. So it's pretty easy to do, isn't it? And for some people, it can be an emotional regulator as well. So,
Absolutely, yeah. And I think I was just going to say on that. I think if you know about binge eating, it's like what you're talking about is nothing compared to what can be eaten. You're talking about,
no, yeah,
half a tub of bites is nothing. I'm like, but it was literally to the point where it's like, I mean, that wouldn't even hit the sides in that way. But yeah, for sure, definitely the association or the comfort part of it is in the food, right? So it's like it's yeah, the guilt has come up, or the judgment of how much was eaten the day before and what the scales are showing or not showing, because I would refuse to weigh myself at those times. But and then it was, yeah, the next day is that comfort then again in eating something in those moments to have that momentary relief. Before then, obviously the guilt comes back in, and
yeah.
the cycle continues. So absolutely, yeah.
So let's go a little bit maybe to the values, because you were talking about comfort as being a value, obviously back in the younger days and when the eating was going strong, and love too. And then you talked about you changed your meaning, and nowadays in the present moment your health's much more important to you than perhaps
Mm.
it was in the earlier days. So what's been the values shift for you, would you say, in the last
Well, I guess
however many years?
valuing that. Okay, yeah, valuing health in terms of
And
being
why?
more aware.
Just in terms of what is the association now with health that puts that so much further up the priority stack than it
I
was
mean,
all those years ago?
hopefully living longer.
Yeah,
In
cool.
terms of that, hopefully not getting as sick as maybe
Mm,
I may get sick if I carried on eating that
okay.
stuff. Definitely things like from a vanity perspective, the impact I would do. I I did a couple of like cleanses at first when I was first not having sugar. It's kind of normalized now, and the difference it made to my skin, all of that, just seeing all possibilities. And I think that's it. It's kind of like as well as all of the mind work that's been studied and done. It's like that's being done in service of trying to be the best version possible of self, and the same with the body, right? The same with all of that. It's going, if I eat the best that I can, if I I used to smoke, and that used to be the highest, one of the highest
Would
things.
you
I loved smoking, and
really?
drinking didn't love
Yeah.
as much, but that was kind of done. But all of those things, all of that stuff started to shift out, as this higher priority, I guess, became of what's the best that I can be as a human being, right? How
Mm,
what's
mm, mm.
possible in terms of what's the potential of us as humans if we're not just constantly stuffing this crap in our face and drinking and smoking and
It's
and
amazing
all
too,
that.
isn't it? Like
Yeah,
I didn't know that you used to smoke, so I've learned something new today. So thank you for
yeah. I
sharing.
smoked from
And
that was probably from about 13 to. I mean, I smoked a lot. 24, I
yeah,
think I gave
wow.
up. So I smoked a yeah. Yeah,
Okay, yeah, amazing.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
one of the benefits of smoking is appetite suppression and weight control. So isn't it
That never
interesting
made a
because
difference to me. Yeah, people would always
never
say when
made
you
a
give up, you're
difference?
going to put
Yeah,
on weight. But the eating disorder was the eating disorder. It wasn't
yeah, yeah.
it just yeah,
No,
yeah.
I bring it up because sometimes I wonder, whether there's unconscious wisdom that goes on with these sort of things,
Mm,
where we're not necessarily conscious that we might be doing something that has a secondary gain.
mm.
And so, I guess that's where I'm going with the observation.
I
And
just love the smoke. Yeah, I think
yeah,
I like the smoke. I guess it's the same. It's the same thing, right? That in the same way that the putting the food in the mouth, it's the same thing as
yeah,
putting a cigarette in the mouth. It was
yeah,
just the constant need for distraction in that way, I guess.
yeah,
So yeah,
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 fab.
yeah.
So, for the listeners, I'm just going to make a couple of statements that hopefully add some value, and then I'm going to invite us to close up for today. I think a couple of things that you've shared today, are really cool. One is that all of these things, whether it's binge eating or alcohol, etc., there's going to be some sort of positive intention associated with it, and we always say that in coaching. So, if you're watching this and you're struggling with some form of addiction, whatever it is, doesn't matter whether it's food or alcohol or anything else, look at what your positive intention is, and then also have a look at what you might be gaining. We call it a secondary gain, but what are you gaining as an offshoot or a byproduct of doing whatever you're doing? And I just say to the audience, always look to the emotions that are underneath it, because yes, our thoughts drive the bus, but ultimately our thoughts are on behalf of our emotions. And so emotions are king, queen, jester, and all of the above in this stuff. And so, there's a couple of things for the audience to perhaps take away if this is resonating for you. And I love your story today. I've learned a fair bit. So
I think it's
tell
really
me.
key with that, because what can typically happen is, as coaches, when we ask the question, and myself getting asked that as well back in the day, is when we go, what's the positive intention, what's the secondary gain, most people will go nothing. It's quite normal to go nothing. I shouldn't be doing it. Or they'll go, well, I'm doing it because, but I shouldn't be doing it. And it's kind of like, stick with the first part of it. It's like, find the reason for you, rather than trying to butt your way out of it, judge your way out of it, because you're not. So it's really important within that is to acknowledge, what is the positive intention? There's always, even though the outcome may not be positive, the intention in the moment, it will be being used for something, like alcohol to relax you, food to, stop you judging yourself, whatever it is. That in the moment is the positive intention of the moment. The outcome may be not positive, but stick with that. And the work then goes towards, bringing in some acceptance, whatever, whatever happens with that, some compassion for yourself of where it might have started and all the rest of it. And then that process can, once you've done that work, it can be easier to start to make changes.
Oh yeah. It's a great share. I mean, I was never an alcoholic or anything like that, but I used to love a drop on a Friday night and a Thursday night and a Saturday night and a Sunday afternoon as well, particularly in the 20s. And I'd probably easy have a dozen pints in a sitting, like it was fairly excessive, to the point where I had really no recollection of what happened for the preceding 4 or 5 hours. But really the reason for me was just to completely let go of any inhibitions. I just loved being free.
But this is a good one then, if anyone's listening, to go, not for for anyone, if they resonate with that as well. It's like there's a presupposition there that we're not free and that we can't let ourselves go. But this is really big, because I see a lot of people in that drinking space that are also not alcoholics, whatever an alcoholic is in that sense. But it's enough that it doesn't matter whether we label ourselves an alcoholic or not. If we are using whether it's food, whether it's alcohol, blah, 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 the rest of it, if we're using it to try and get us somewhere that we don't believe we are when we're without it, then there's the work to do. And there's nothing wrong with anyone. It doesn't make you an alcoholic or anything like that. But it's just like, what an amazing opportunity to be able to explore why we maybe can't be ourselves. If we're not drunk and all the rest of it, because it's so common. Yeah.
Totally true. Awesome. Okay, so we're almost at time. So, I'd just like to invite you to share anything that you feel, is worth sharing, or anything with the audience that you'd like them to take away, just to bring us to a close. Anita, it's been really good. Thank you for sharing.
If anyone wants to get in touch, to talk about any of this stuff or anything at all, then please do. It's a big one. I think because there's been so much time that has passed for me, it can be something that gets forgotten. But, when I meet people and they're in this sort of phase of the kind of real worst part of it, it can seem like there's no way out of this. How will I ever change? And, through all of this, what I learned a lot was that piece as well, that once the work had been done, there was still a habit to break. And so with some people that come in, to coaching, they might already be at the habit breaking point, and they may have already done all the exploration of the other stuff. For some people, it's a longer process of doing the exploratory work, and there's a part of it as well, which is, you know, it is a bit like, it's that acceptance, and this is the hard part. It's that acceptance of be with where you're at right now, and stop trying to, because this is the thing that we do, is try to put the rules on ourselves. Got to stop this, got to not be on Instagram, got to not pick up my phone, got to not smoke, got to not eat, you know, all the rest of it. And oftentimes you may go for a little while, or we may go for a little while with the rules, and because we haven't delved into the deeper work, we're soon breaking our rules, and we're back on Instagram or whatever after we said we're never going to go on it. Or dating apps is one I hear a lot of, and it's like exploring what, you know, what is it about the dating apps, or Instagram, or the food, or the drink, or whatever. You know, the less we can make it about the story on the surface, and more we get into the purposes that it's serving, and what we're, you know, the deep beliefs that we're holding about ourselves, the more chance there is that those habits will then be easier to break. So
Yeah, fabulous. Amazing. Okay. Well, thank you so much for
Cool.
coming on and sharing your story again. I know you've done it a few times, but thank you for sharing with our audience, and it was brilliant.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. See you all next time.
See you next time.